think that I can safely say, as a writer and as a woman, there are few things as offensive to me as the abysmal destruction of Nancy Wheeler's character arc. Oh yeah, I'm making an entire video about this. I will never get over this character assassination. To put it simply, Stranger Things Season 5 had issues. And most of those issues are writing related at some point, but the worst, the absolute worst, in my opinion, is that of the destruction of Nancy Wheeler. Mike, I think, comes as a close second, but is a tad less egregious by pure default of they had already screwed over Mike's character arc back in season 3. This particular section did not necessarily improve or disprove any pre-existing problems with Mike, so Nancy, in contrast, seemed to be a relatively strong and stable character up through season 4. In fact, I think season 4 was the strongest for her character out of the entire show. It was an excellent evolution from her roles in seasons 1 and 2, as we'll get into later, and was masterfully addressing her character flaws and problems even as she continued to grow and change. And then season 5 came around, and, well, that ended badly. Suffice it to say, my issues with Nancy Wheeler's character arc are various, and I have a list, but the most egregious problem with it, and the reason that I'm making this video in the first place, is Nancy's ending in the epilogue, and the complete disservice done to her as a complex three-dimensional character in favor of, in my opinion, the writers trying to diminish her depth and create a one-dimensional Rambo. It is painful for me to have to make a video on this and have to analyze it, but I think it's also an important lesson to be learned. Nancy Wheeler was an excellent character with depth, dimension, and a fascinating story, combating the stereotypical straight-A student with the badass. And I love both sides of her personality, but by detracting all other aspects and turning her simply into a badass, hyper-masculine action hero, you take away from the depth and ability of Nancy's character and fall into, in my opinion, the worst aspects of the male gaze. That's right, I dropped the male gaze this early into the video. Feel free to leave your angry anti-feminist hate comment now. I will accept it gladly. Jokes aside, as a woman, and as someone who studied and researched the male gaze, I can safely assure you that the issue with Nancy Wheeler isn't that she's a strong, powerful character. It's that by creating a one-dimensional action hero, they neglect the actual strength and depth that her character had originally built over the course of 4 seasons. And like 7-8 years for some reason. Anywho, let's get into it. To start off, I feel again the need to preface the fact that it is astonishing to me that CW characters in the 2010s had better character endings than this woman. To establish my main issue with Nancy, and before I get into my brief overview of her character arcs across the seasons, Nancy Wheeler in Stranger Things Season 5 feels so devoid from the original emotionally deep and fascinating character that I am left feeling nothing but anger, sadness, and most importantly of all, bitterness. Because that is what I feel watching Nancy, especially in the later episodes of Season 5. All traces of her previous depth and emotion gone. She doesn't even show much emotion after her sister is kidnapped. And some are going to say that's acting. It's not. The writers purposely wrote a very detached, guilt-ridden speech and yet didn't want to address it. Nancy feels guilt over Holly being kidnapped and her parents being hurt, but it's never brought up again. She immediately pushes it to a side and becomes a thoroughly focused action hero. And that's not to say she shouldn't be an action hero. I am not in this video arguing that Nancy should not be an action hero. And this is going to be especially important because someone's going to counter-argue when we get to the romance section, and someone's going to counter-argue later when I get to my issues with the epilogue. But I am being very clear here. I am not saying I wanted any of Nancy's characters sacrificed. I'm saying by turning her into a one-note action hero, they sacrificed her original depth. And her original depth was actually the point of her character. Nancy Wheeler is, in my mind, before Season 5, is the epitome of an attempt at recreating types of 80s stereotypes, but combining them. She is an amalgamation of classic 80s horror main characters, only instead of being a smart good girl who then becomes a badass with a stint of scared damsel, Nancy is three-dimensional. She has the time to breathe and develop. She has the time to express her problems with the way her parents' marriage works, with the idea of a loveless relationship forced on you by society. And don't worry, we'll get back to that too. I'm saving the romances for the end because that is literally the least of my issues with her character. Nancy, on the whole, is not supposed to be a destruction of societal norms. None of the characters are supposed to be a destruction of societal norms, and anyone trying to argue with that doesn't understand character writing in the first place. If you are going to write a character and you want to shift or move around a established character arc, you are going to take a stereotype and then push it forward. Leigh Bardugo talks about this in a couple of interviews, saying she started her Six of Crows books with these archetypal characters and then moved from there. However, even though you have an archetype that you're then bending, that does not necessarily mean you break the original character mold of the archetype. If you pick a character who is supposed to be a goal-oriented straight-A student, they're not going to suddenly drop all of that. And in early seasons, the writers understood that. In season 2, Nancy was still just as devoted to her studies and skilled with weapons, but she swiftly became centered on her guilt and her trauma, and we'll get into that in a minute too. But the most important part about Nancy throughout the first 4 seasons was that she was a bending, a shift of an archetypal character, a combination of different archetypes to create something fascinating. A lot of women, I think, especially, and I know that there are probably men watching this, and you can take this as you will, but I think a lot of women in recent years have taken issue with the idea of doing it all, doing multiple things. But in essence, that is the history of women across the world. Women have always done various things. They have never been one thing, either a career woman or a housewife. And I know this is going to sound insane, but to back up my point, I feel the need to bring in the history of the cottage industry, a system in which cottage homes throughout European societies for centuries before the Industrial Revolution were focused on a system in which the men were farmers or blacksmiths or fishermen, and women, who would either be their wives or daughters, would have a cottage industry, for instance, lace making, cheese making, or other important skills. And there was even a period of time in which women could inherit their husbands' mills or blacksmiths, though that is its own history. This history of women doing multiple things, raising children and doing work, is a core piece of history and of women's place within societal structures. The modern concept of women only being able to do one thing, be a housewife or be a career woman, is in fact false. And the prevalence of it within media is only pushing more people to actually misunderstand the abilities and the importance of women being portrayed as doing multiple things. This is, I think, one of the reasons Nancy was always a more compelling female character than Eleven. While many people do love Eleven, Nancy Wheeler, in terms of depth, has always had more detail given to her as a real person. Nancy was a character that the average audience member, be they someone who grew up in the 80s or be they a 15-year-old watching in the 2010s, could relate to. Nancy is a character who does various things for various reasons and combines archetypes and stereotypes. Nancy is a character who, until season 5, emphasized the importance of breaking the preconceived notions that women could only do one thing that were highly prevalent within 80s media. Take, for instance, Die Hard. She's a career woman, so her marriage has fallen apart and her children are neglected while she's, being held hostage by Professor Snape during a Christmas Eve party that turns into, well, death. Anywho, to really emphasize how Nancy represents and takes apart these different archetypes and combines them to create a three-dimensional character, I'm going to briefly go through the scope of her character development and explain how this fits into this narrative framework. But before I do that, I have to do a quick divergence. While I'm here, I feel the need to really emphasize something about a character arc, because I talked about this briefly in my previous video on Stranger Things. Check that out if you haven't already. All of my issues with the last episode put into a lengthy diatribe and a lot of rage. And I did, if people coming from that video, I do hear the comments about the microphone. I heard them, I understand. It's down here for a reason. Specifically, before we get into Nancy, I really want to emphasize that I am not saying that every character has to have a character arc. Someone's probably going to try and make that argument. I'm not. I'm saying that until now, Nancy had a character arc that was going in a direction of growth. And by the end of my explanation of what happened to her across the seasons, you're going to see that Nancy's original positive change arc ended up taking her right back to the beginning of season 2. That's the problem. Not even season 1. The beginning of season 2, her character arc did not take her back to the start. It wasn't a loop. It wasn't a weird, not really a good description. Nancy's decisions at the end of season 5 take her right back to her season 2 self. Objectively, the self she needed to grow and change from the most. So it is therefore time to jump into the history of Nancy Wheeler's original character development across all 5 seasons, abridged for time. Starting with season 1, Nancy Wheeler is a fascinating character. She starts out as a classic straight-A student, good girl who isn't necessarily popular, but isn't necessarily an outcast in the same way as her brothers either. No wonder I relate to her so much. Throughout the course of the season and the loss of her best friend Barb, Nancy develops from a girl with determination who is scared to show it to a strong-willed and accepting character. She uses her straight-A student, top-of-the-class tendencies to create a plan to kill the Demogorgon and start investigating what happened to Barb. She combines this with a newfound, seemingly already skilled ability to wield a gun. And while I do respect that she's a badass with a gun, I do think that it's a disservice that it's never explained truly why she is so good at it. She just points and shoots. I promise that's not actually how anyone gets good at any form of weaponry skill. I'm a writer. I research this stuff. This was sort of, I think, the first cracks in what would later become an apparent problem with a lot of the Stranger Things writing. Characters who do things and are suddenly brilliant at them for no apparent reason. A flaw that they definitely seemed conscious of by, for some reason, including the weird parkour thing at the beginning of season 5. Yeah, it was a whole thing. Nancy's ability to simply be a warrior without any training takes away from the potential importance that could have given her. Or it takes away from simply a throwaway line saying, yeah, my dad taught me to shoot, or something like that, which could add depth to her fears of becoming like her parents. Because here is the thing, and this is something I really want to emphasize in this exploration of Nancy's character as we're going season by season. Nancy's fears, as she expresses to Jonathan in this scene, are not of marriage or family or even love. Nancy's fears are of being in a societally forced arrangement. The implication that society is forcing her to live a lie because everyone expects X, Y, and Z from her. It is the idea that her mother is unhappy because in order for her life to be successful, she married a man she clearly did not love that much and settled down in an expensive house on the cul-de-sac. Nancy's issue here is not with marriage, not with romance. It's with conformity to societal expectations. This is a key distinction that will come into play when we get to the romance section. Don't worry, we'll get there. We'll get there soon. Season 1 also briefly addresses her trauma as her focus on Barb and her fear following, the whole upside down thing. Do you know what it doesn't do, though? It doesn't actually put words to the PTSD that she should have clearly had, because that's a recurring theme in this show, is the ignorance to PTSD that its characters should clearly have, especially at their young age. But I digress again. We're moving on to season 2. Because Nancy's arc by the end of season 1 was pretty solid. She went from scared of being her true self to determined and accepting of her true self. Okay. Problem is, then they kept going, and season 2 was okay. Nancy in season 2 transforms from simply a secondary character to a perceived heroine. She has a defined goal. She is fighting for justice for her friend Barb. This is a critical piece of her story arc, and her entire goal this season, revealing the military, trying to get them to leave Hawkins, is an attempt to save future people from the potential danger that Barb faced, resulting in her death. This is a critical piece of the story. This season transforms Nancy from simply a growing, evolving character to a character on a quest for justice, creating a heroine-esque feel to her. She keeps her abilities with a gun. She is still physically able. And again, I like to emphasize here the scene at the end of season 2, right before Elle returns, in which it is only Nancy, Stephen Hopper, and Lucas who have weapons. This scene. Another important element this season is the visuals. Nancy's hair has been cut shorter and gotten quite a bit poofier, a visual representation of not only the show transitioning further into the 80s, but also of Nancy in general embracing the style of the time. That said, the lacking of color in her wardrobe this season, it's weird. Yeah. The warning signs in hindsight were there that the Duffer Brothers didn't want to make her a complex, nuanced female character in the end. It was okay, except for one thing. And someone in the comments is going to yell at me. Someone in the comments is going to yell at me about this. I don't care. Go for it. Try and make me believe for 1 second that Nancy Wheeler becoming a cheater was good for her character. And someone's gonna go, oh no, she and Steve had broken up. No, they hadn't. Was Steve a douche for leaving her at that party drunk? Yes, but he knew Jonathan would take her home. I am not saying that Jonathan and Nancy getting together in this season was a problem for her character. I'm saying them getting together because Murray freaking told them to was bad, especially because, as established by Steve going to her house to apologize in episode 5, is it 5? I think it was 5, when he ends up meeting Dustin, and we'll get into that in my Steve video of how he is just a perfect character arc, but like the cause and effect. The fact that Nancy became a cheater this season is pointless, and this shows a greater issue, I think, across the entirety of the show's seasons for a disconnect between the love triangle the Duffer Brothers wanted to explore and the characters within the love triangle's individual character arcs. And ironically enough, the character arc that suffered the most in this love triangle wasn't even Jonathan. They'd given up on Jonathan already by the time you get to the end of season 2 for reasons I don't understand. But it wasn't because all of his scenes were devoted to Nancy. No. They were devoted to Will, but they didn't give him time to express it. Nancy, objectively, is the character, especially in season 2, done the dirtiest by the love triangle plotline. Because the thing is, Nancy doesn't ever actually get closure. Her problems with her relationship with Steve are focused on, and it's back up again, her trauma. They are not because of Steve, they are because she blames herself for Barb, a fact that the season emphasizes to a reasonable degree. The problem is, her closure with Steve, their breakup, is simply he accepts that she's better than him. Okay. But then why did Nancy not get to express her traumas to him in that moment? Or later? Or ever? Nancy's only expression of her trauma about Barb this entire season, well, aside from those early couple episodes, was the Halloween party, which was good. Except here's the thing. If your most visibly traumatized character, and somehow the only character up to this point in the story who has any semblance of PTSD or guilt relating to things that have happened in the first season, because let's be honest, Mike was like completely lacking. Mike did not have appropriate PTSD. He still thought Elle was out there, but he didn't have any fearful reactions of all the horrible things he did, which I think is an oversight by the writers. But I stand by my original focus, Nancy's trauma. If the only time your character actually puts into words their trauma and guilt is in a drunk scene that is more so focused on the romance drama than the character drama, you are losing a key component of her trauma. Even though it was addressed this season, the warning signs and the beginnings of what I think is the abandonment of Nancy's character arc began here. Because by brushing past Nancy's trauma and pushing through and making it seem like simply revealing the military dealt with the trauma, you are combining two types of character arc, a heroic arc and a personal growth arc. A heroic arc, often referred to as the hero's or heroine's journey, and they are two different things that I'm not going to get into today, but suffice it to say one is more physical focused and one is more emotional focused. Nancy is in fact, fulfilling neither. By focusing entirely on her heroic arc and not discussing the emotions that led her there, you are disserving her character. And if it's one thing that season 3 loves doing, it's disserving previous characters. Ironically enough, season 3 pisses me off about Mike way more than Nancy, but that's its own video. I might do a video on Mike. I don't know. I'm gonna probably get burnt out from Stranger Things soon because I'm just so angry about it and I should stop. But Nancy is the one that I'm really emotionally invested in. The season 3 arc for Nancy boils down to men are mean, no one believes Nancy. Again, it's 3rd season. And this results in tension, trauma, and then she's magically right about everything. Do you know how annoying it is that this could have been good, except it wasn't? Because here's the thing about season 3. Nancy's trauma from season 2 is still unresolved, as already established. It's still unresolved. It's never brought up. Nancy's trauma is never once discussed in this season. She's healed. Everyone's healed. In fact, no trauma seems to be befalling these teenagers for some reason. Fine. Anywho, her arc as a reporter desperate to prove herself is a fine, physical, active arc for her character, but the complete ignorance to her previous traumas and emotional depth begin to show a clear sign of divide for what the Duffer Brothers are doing with her character versus what her character was originally intended to be. They're falling into the trap that they originally tried so hard to avoid by making her one note, by turning her into an always right action badass. And yes, she almost dies once or twice, but everyone almost dies once or twice. By completely ignoring and never addressing her trauma or her emotional issues with Jonathan in this season, there is a lack of depth to her character. She's an action set piece, something to move the plot along, a detective and a devoted aspiring journalist, yes, but a lacking one, because there's no emotional drive. Her only motivation this season is wanting to prove that she can do it, to prove herself in a world of men. And that would have been better if at any point in the previous 2 seasons there had been a connection to men being sexist to Nancy and struggling with her stuff. Do you know when this is a good obstacle? At the beginning. And another problem with her character in this season especially is the writer's complete forgetfulness that Nancy has relationships with anyone besides Jonathan. Because if you really look at it, Nancy does not interact on her own with anyone but Jonathan until the end of the season. Not even her mother, not even her brother, not even like Elle or something. Nancy does not interact with people this season who aren't Jonathan. And this is a problem because Nancy's character arc slowly becomes entirely focused on 2 things: being a determined, always right action badass, and being in a relationship with Jonathan. And this is a problem that I think I see a lot of writers make, which is when you create a character in a romance, in a romantic subplot especially, you entirely focus all of their scenes with that romantic partner. And that is a problem. And that is something that I, as a writer who writes romantic subplots, have to actively remind myself not to do. Because a character's entire self being devoted around, in this case, her boyfriend, it's not good for her character. Because Nancy only ever seems to have scenes with Jonathan, her depth is hindered because her and Jonathan's issues will always be different than her issues with herself and her issues or interactions or dynamics with other characters. In previous seasons, Nancy has had scenes with Mike, with Steve, with her mother, with even Dustin. These are all people who we've established are either her friends, family, or people she cares about. And in season 3, the only people she has direct one-on-one convos with are Jonathan. That is a detriment to her character and to her development and to her ability to grow and change. By centering her character on just Jonathan and action hero, you take away from the 3 dimensions that she'd been previously established to explore, and instead decided, you know what, no, we just want her to be an action hero and in a romantic relationship. This is when I get to make a joke about the fact that Buffy the Vampire Slayer already did this plotline and somehow did it better. The final aspect that I want to establish here also is the visuals of Nancy this season. Again, her hair is poofier, still short, but she is wearing a lot more dresses and bright colors. And something that I think a lot of people want to point out, but I want to dissuade here, is the fact that the dresses and the bright colors are anti-Nancy. Do I think that Nancy hates dresses? No, I don't. Do I think that Nancy hates wearing the high heels? Well, for practicality, yes. I'm wearing them right now, but that's because I am sitting around in my house and don't have to go walking across town or fighting monsters. I can enjoy a good heeled boot in the comfort of my own New England home. Nancy Wheeler has activities to do. Some flats would be preferred. A lot of people like to take Nancy dressing more stylistically more feminine in this season as with a false persona she's putting on to appease her sexist bosses. That is not a fact. That is not subtext. That is not even visual text. Nancy, after she changes out of the boss-approved clothes, I'd like to remind all of you, is wearing pink, because pink somehow becomes a crux of discourse around Nancy Wheeler. Yeah, that's where we're at, people. It's 2026, and we're discussing colors when we should be discussing character arcs. Anywho, season 4. Season 4 is, I am not ashamed to say, my favorite season. And I know a lot of people disagree with me on that, and I think that's fine. It is my favorite season. It's amazing. That is not to say there aren't flaws with it. I am very aware that there are quite a few flaws with this season, and I think it's important to discuss them. That's not what I'm here to do today. I'm here to discuss Nancy's character arc in season 4 and finally, thank the gods, there's character again. Season 4, on the whole, is a season in which Nancy's character is given, I think, the most time to address its problems since like early season 2. Nancy's trauma and guilt and emotions are front and center this season. Her determination leads her to bringing Fred to the trailer park, which leads to Fred's death, which leads to her guilt, which leads to a revisiting of how her guilt and her trauma drive her for justice. This is the original point of her season 2 arc that was sort of lost because all of her scenes became Jonathan focused. As such, season 4 does a better job addressing her trauma and the way it impacts her character arc. This season also does the thing that it should have started doing in this season, also remedies the problem, as previously mentioned in season 3. Nancy interacts with different people. She interacts with Dustin and Steve, and we get the excellent interactions between her and Robin that were for some reason abandoned in season 5, and I'm still not over it, and it's fine. I'm fine. It's fine. Nancy Wheeler from season 4 on its own is a good developmental arc. Nancy is established as knowing what she wants, knowing her goals, and being determined to reach them, a character trait she's always had. She is also, I'd say, in her most 80s style, and I think this style really works with her visually with her determination. She is both feminine and physically able. This is a key part of creating a three-dimensional woman. Because, and this is where the male gaze comes into it, the idea that a woman can only be physically strong or badass because she is hypermasculine in terms of two things, A, being emotionless, and B, being physically masculine, is a recurring trope, especially in action and speculative fiction films and TV shows, that greatly plays into this trope of a male-centered audience. The men watching only think that a woman is badass if she looks like a man. By not falling into this trap in season 4, Nancy actually still retains that original attempt, that original goal of combating stereotypes, of becoming a three-dimensional character who has her own personal style, her own emotional depth, and still remains a physical badass and a determined heroine. Her problems with Jonathan and her reconnection with Steve also both make narrative sense within the season. Her problems with Jonathan because long-distance romance sucks and they're not communicating. This makes total sense. This tracks with her character. Nancy has trouble communicating, especially when it comes to romantic relationships. I think we can all safely say her parents are partly to blame for this because Mike has these issues too. And this is something that is never properly addressed with her, which again takes away, but hey, it's a flaw. Her reconnection to Steve also makes sense with her trauma. Even though she is no longer with him, she still clearly cares deeply about him. They were together for more than a year of their lives. They know each other. Her devotion to him, her decision to jump right in after him in the lake, fits with her trauma. She can't lose another person she loves. She can't do it. And this keeps her grounded in both being an action heroine and an emotionally depth character. This is where Nancy Wheeler, as a character with depth and detail, ends, because season 4's excellent exploration of all of her potential is immediately, and by immediately I mean 3-ish years later, destroyed by season 5. The crux of the ruining of Nancy Wheeler. The closest we get to multi-dimensional Nancy comes in season 5, volume 1, where she is, as aforementioned, a leader. Her and Mike both retaining these original roles of determined leaders that worked so well for them previously. Mike in season 1 and Nancy especially in season 4. These are great examples of character depth. How long does this last? First episode. Nancy and Mike lose all of that, their leader attempts. It gets completely abandoned. As previously mentioned, the ignorance to Nancy's trauma in season 5 is one of the crucial pieces of her destroyed character. Her sister has been kidnapped by a Demogorgon, her parents are lying in the hospital, should be dead, and she has no flashbacks. She has that scene where she's rubbing her hands raw to get the blood off and that little moment of guilt, but no emotional conversations, no discussions, no focus on anything. It suddenly jumps from "it's our fault, Mike" to plot speculation, to Lucas being weird and cryptic. Where is the exploration of her trauma? Where is the acceptance of her character? Nancy is abandoned in favor of the plot. Everyone is abandoned in favor of the plot, but Nancy especially. Because what annoys me about what they did to Nancy this season is there were times when her trauma and her emotion could have been dealt with. Like when she was having that conversation with Mike. She could have had a Freudian slip. She could have made a comment referencing Barb. She could have done so many things, but she didn't, because the writers didn't want to deal with their characters having emotions and traumas. They wanted to focus on the plot and on the action. Her emotions are also completely lacking. When is Nancy emotional? When is she shown to be anything but an action set piece after those first 2-ish episodes? I'm waiting. And if you say the proposal scene, yes, we'll get to that. But she's still not even shown to be that emotional in that scene. She's emotional because she thinks they're about to die, not because she is appropriately addressing any of her character, not because it's already been established that Nancy cares deeply about her friends, about her family. That is completely lost, hidden under a veneer of the action badass. The scene where she threatens to shoot Murray and Jonathan while they, mind you, are discussing an engagement ring is a perfect example of this ignorance to her emotions. They're trying to get away with pulling a Nancy covers her emotions with being a badass thing. That's not the point of her character. Nancy's emotions drive her devotion to being a strong-willed character. Her emotions drive her action sequences. This has always been a part of Nancy. Again, even in that climactic brilliance at the end of season 4, where Nancy is killing Vecna, you can clearly see emotion. There is emotion, this desperate attempt to get rid of Vecna to protect her family. Where is this emotion in season 5? It's gone. Volume 2 continues this trend, and even I'd say worsens it, because the only scene that she has in this entire volume with another character, a heart-to-heart discussion, is with Jonathan. It's doing the season 3 problems all over again, focusing as if all of her emotions and character arc are focused on her romantic relationships. That is not how you write a 3-dimensional female character. You do not write women by making them be action badasses one moment and entirely devoted to a relationship the next. That is not realistic. That is not the previously established depth that Nancy has. It's lazy. And it's painful and offensive to me as someone who loves her character and wish that she got a better ending. And now we get to volume 3. And volume 3 Nancy, before the epilogue, she's just Rambo. She's Rambo with plot armor. And somehow, Rambo's trauma is explored more than Nancy's in less time. Rambo's trauma is explored more than Nancy's. I spent weeks of my time analyzing the lack of emotional depth to action heroes in 80s cinema. And when I tell you Rambo's trauma was still addressed more than Nancy Wheeler's in the 80s. Yeah. Nancy, in the entirety of that battle, is pointless because all Nancy is there for is to be an emotionless action heroine. Her reunion with Holly isn't even that deep because there is no focus. And yes, we have a little flash of, oh, Barb, when Vecna is killed, when we pan to Nancy. But does that actually address her trauma? No. Her trauma with Barb remains unaddressed. It has never been addressed. Never on screen have we fully dealt with the fact that Nancy blames herself for Barb's death. They could have even been lazy enough in this epilogue to make a throwaway line about a therapist, and I would have laughed at it. But honestly, I wouldn't have minded because at least it would have added something to this. Because yes, my friends, we have finally reached the pièce de résistance of perfect people-pleasing stupidity, the pièce de résistance of bad character work, the epilogue. I've already ranted about the epilogue in depth in my Volume 3 video. I highly recommend you watch that if you want a lengthy, vaguely scream-filled rant about my problems with it. There are many. But for the sake of today, we are focusing specifically on the destruction of Nancy Wheeler that was really just driven. The knife was just dug in further to us in the epilogue. Because if there is one thing that offends me more than anything else, and there are many things that offend me about this epilogue, it is the fact that for some reason, in this final moment where they were supposed to wrap things up, the Duffer Brothers decided in their infinite wisdom to completely erase one of the only still standing core tenets of Nancy Wheeler's character and have her drop out of college. Girl, you got into a college known for an excellent creative writing program and dropped out because you weren't feeling it? Nancy Wheeler, previously established to be determined and hyper-focused, previously established to know what she wants in life, dropping out of college to, and then work for the Globe. This is a spit in the face of Nancy's character. She's known what she wanted. She's known for years. She is devoted and determined. Never once in this season was there a scene where she talked about not knowing what she wanted. So why add this in? What, cheap shock value? Cheap, oh, she's on her own now? She doesn't need conformity? She doesn't need her college degree? Girl, it's the 1980s. Get your college degree. Do you know how expensive a college degree is now? Get your degree, get an internship, go off and flourish. This conformity, this obsessive focus on Nancy Wheeler being, how do I put this, not of the status quo, rejecting society, doesn't work with her character. It works with Jonathan. Jonathan deciding to make anti-capitalist cannibalism films, for some reason, makes total sense with him. It works for Robin. Robin going to Smith. That makes total sense for her. It could have even worked for Steve, but it doesn't work for Nancy. Nancy completely abandoning her previous goals is a detrimental destruction to her character. And this is piled on by the forced visual masculinity of the epilogue. I am not in the market of overanalyzing visuals. I promise. That said, the fact that for some reason they decided that Nancy Wheeler was going to end this season in an oversized, shoulder pad-laden, dark beige suit and what I'm pretty sure is one of Steve's old wigs offends me. As a woman, I am offended that your example of what was once a three-dimensional, deeply interesting character, who I related to on so many levels, even though she was vastly different than me in various regards, was absolutely destroyed because you wanted to make sure that she couldn't possibly fit the stereotypes of being a girl. Because this forced visual masculinity that you impose upon her is a problem. It is a detrimental problem because it is implying that her only place of success, that her only way to succeed in this world she loves is to be a man, is to be masculine. is to dress in no color, is to have short hair, and is to be entirely emotionless and alone. Congratulations! You have fallen into the 3 most consistent misogynistic traps. Well done. You turned a 3-dimensional woman into a perfect example of misogyny in action. Wonderful. Thank you. I'm really seen as a woman who related to Nancy. And so it seems is the rest of the internet, who agrees with me that it's stupid. But this lack of color in Nancy in this final scene brings us to the pink sweater. Yes, I dressed accordingly. And brings us, of course, to the romance of it all. I'm going to be brief. I am biased. If you couldn't already guess, I have a bias. Everyone has a bias in this relationship. But here's the thing. My problem isn't even that she didn't end up with one or the other. My problem is the complete spitting in the faces of the audience that is the way the romances are portrayed, and more so even than that, the way Jonathan talks throughout the season. The way he emphasizes throwing away Nancy's favorite pink sweater. Now, I'm talking about the pink sweater very quickly because I want to establish something. Nancy, throughout this season, has been shown to wear pink. In fact, she's in a full head-to-toe pink getup for multiple episodes of this season. So what, you're saying she was confined by pink and she gets to the end and she must now be colorless and beige and masculine? You're saying that that scene with Jonathan was supposed to imply and fully establish that Nancy has been confined by femininity and classically feminine coded colors such as pink. Is that what you're trying to say? Are you trying to say something like that, Duffer Brothers? Because I cannot for one moment imagine why is it like this otherwise? What is the point depicting Nancy as a complex, 3-dimensional character who can both be physically badass and visibly feminine if you're just going to throw it away in the epilogue and completely abandon all depth of character? And what is the point of having her end up with neither of them if most of her individual scenes for seasons 2, 3, and 5 were devoted to her relationship? I'll go even further. Multiple scenes of Nancy and Robin in season 4 were devoted to Nancy's emotional relationship with Steve. Why write a romance? Why spend most of Nancy's scenes in this show focused on her romantic relationships with both Steve and Jonathan if the conclusion is she ends up with no one? Why? Why? What purpose does it serve? In fact, it actively degrades from earlier plot lines. If her relationship with Jonathan was going to implode eventually, why did all of her scenes individually in season 3 focus on Jonathan? If her relationship with Steve was gonna go nowhere because you were petty and scared and really honed in on that 6-nugget line that was actually an allegory for the children he babysits, why? Why do any of this? Why put in all of this effort if she's not gonna end up with either of them? And the Duffer Brothers have tried to get away with this and also get away with Robin and Vicky seemingly breaking up by the epilogue by trying to claim, oh, it's unrealistic that, people end up with the person they're with in high school. Guys, I don't mean to step on your toes here, but Max and Lucas end up together. Max and Lucas have been dating since middle school. Okay. So what you're saying is that your excuse for making Nancy end up with no one and for making Robin and Vicky break up is that it's unrealistic that a couple stays together if they get together in high school for long term. I'm not denying that. That is unrealistic. But do you know what else this is? This is fiction, Duffer Brothers. This is a fictional narrative. When you write a romantic relationship in fiction, it has a point to it. In fiction, romantic